Some women who have lost their husband and remain behind with children in their arms find very questionable ways to keep themselves afloat. That is exactly what Alex did when she was offered a large sum of money in exchange for a small favor. The mother simply dreamed of giving her sons a better life, but the outcome was sad. Alex took her boys to her parents and sat all alone in front of her computer. She had a difficult day ahead of her the next morning, when she would either solve her financial problems or disappear forever. She was not sure how things would turn out, but her sixth sense told her that this endeavor could be dangerous. Alex thought about the possible outcome in advance and left her son a message, because she was sure her son would know how to behave. This shocking case happened only a few years ago, at the end of 2021, in Hastings, an area in the county of East Sussex in southeastern England. The 33-year-old Alexandra Morgan lived about 30 kilometers from East Sussex, in a town called Cranbrook in Kent, which has just over 6,500 inhabitants. She was a single mother raising two sons. Alexandra, or Alex for short, as her loved ones called her, was a trained dog groomer and loved her job, but unfortunately, it did not offer the financial opportunities she so desperately needed. Caring for two small boys took a lot of time and energy, and providing for her family and caring for the children was her sole responsibility. She could not rely on anyone but herself. Alex worked hard all week, so on November 13, 2021, she took the children to her parents so they could stay with their grandparents for a few days. She told her mother and father that she would spend the weekend at a spa to relax. The next day, November 14, she left the house, got into her car, and drove toward the spa. She promised her parents she would pick up the boys on November 17, but when that day came, Alex did not appear and also did not call to let them know she was running late. Her parents did not panic at first and decided to wait until the next day, but when their daughter also failed to show up on November 18 and did not make contact in any way, Alex's mother turned to the Kent police to report her missing. The investigation into Alexandra Morgan's disappearance began almost immediately. The first thing the police did was search Alex's house in Cranbrook for possible clues about what might have happened to her. Of course, she was not there, and the apartment itself looked normal. There were no signs of a struggle, a forced intrusion, or a burglary, and thus no leads. All the police knew at that time was what Alex's parents had told them. She was planning to go to a spa in York that weekend, which is a few hours' drive from Kent. The police tried to find Alex in her car using surveillance cameras and automatic license plate recognition systems. On the morning of November 14, shortly after leaving her house, a camera at a gas station in nearby Cranbrook captured her. Around 7:30 a.m., she got out of her white Mini Cooper, filled up the car, and exchanged a few words with the cashier, mentioning that she was on her way to a spa in York. However, after leaving the gas station, Alex drove south even though York lies north of Kent. For some reason, she drove in the opposite direction. Why had she lied about going to the spa? Where was she actually heading? To answer these questions, the police continued trying to track Alexandra Morgan's movements on that morning using traffic cameras, but she apparently chose country roads where cameras were much less frequent. During the investigation, the police examined Alex's phone records and discovered that her phone had been active in Hastings in East Sussex before it was switched off. Hastings was the last known location where her phone was traced that morning. The reason why the woman kept her destination secret was still unclear. The police began checking surveillance cameras in the Hastings area, looking for footage of a white Mini Cooper. Eventually, they spotted Alex's car shortly before 8 a.m. on November 14, driving into a scrapyard in Hastings. That site was on a quiet country road called Rock Lane. A woman sat in the car for a while, apparently waiting for someone. Then another car appeared on the same surveillance camera, a gold Jaguar. It drove past Alex's Mini Cooper and turned toward the farmland, and her car then followed it. The person driving that Jaguar might have information about Alexandra Morgan's disappearance and her current whereabouts. The police had to figure out who owned the car and where it was going that morning. They discovered a farm called Little Bridge in Hastings, near the scrapyard. For some reason, Alex had therefore not driven north toward York but rather to that farm. In the evening of November 23, 5 days after Morgan had been reported missing, investigators went there. It took several days to review all the footage and determine approximately where the woman might have gone. Of course, she could have left the farm at any point in that time, but the police at least had a lead. The officers arrived at Little Bridge in the evening, inspected the premises, looked in barns and sheds, and called Alex's name, but there was no trace of her. There was also no sign of Alex's Mini Cooper or of the owners of the property. After their initial search, the police were about to leave when a van suddenly arrived. A man got out of the driver's cab and introduced himself as Mark Brown. He looked to be in his early 40s and had leased Little Bridge Farm. He lived with his wife and child in another part of Hastings and came to the farm to work. Mark Brown was a mechanic who repaired old cars and then sold them at a reasonable price. He had a small workshop on the farm and sometimes got parts from the nearby scrapyard. The police decided to check Brown's identity. He had no criminal record and had never been in trouble with the law. He appeared to be a model family man. However, after talking with him, the officers realized the situation was not that simple. Brown turned out to be the owner of the gold Jaguar caught on surveillance the day Alexandra Morgan disappeared. When investigators began asking him about the missing woman, he did not deny having met Alex on the morning of November 14. He confirmed that they had both driven to Little Bridge Farm. Brown was willing to answer all of the police's questions. He admitted he had met Morgan through a website called Adult Jobs, where escorts offer their services and can be contacted by potential clients. It turned out Alex had secretly been working in the sex industry. Her family and friends had no idea what she was really doing to earn money. Mark Brown had contacted Alex for the first time in June 2021, about 5 or 6 months before she disappeared, and they had stayed in touch ever since. On November 14, the woman arrived at Little Bridge Farm as planned to spend a few hours with Mark, after which, according to him, she got into her car and drove away. Brown claimed that this was the last time he saw Alex, that she was alive and well, and that he had no idea what could have happened to her after she left the farm. At first glance, Brown's story seemed plausible, but the police soon found clues indicating inconsistencies. As mentioned, surveillance cameras near the scrapyard filmed Alex's car heading toward Little Bridge, yet there was no footage of the white Mini Cooper leaving the farm later in the day. Apparently, Mark Brown had lied to the officers. While Alexandra Morgan was still missing, the farm's tenant feared he might be arrested on suspicion of involvement in her disappearance. On November 25, 2021, Mark Brown was taken to a police station for questioning. Investigators hoped he would confess after his arrest, knowing there was no point in hiding the truth. Mark, however, answered most of their questions with a short no comment. The police learned nothing new, as he truly refused to talk about Alex. They therefore had to figure out the circumstances of the woman's disappearance and the nature of her relationship with Brown on their own. Their investigation focused on Little Bridge Farm, 4 hectares of land with several structures, including barns, shipping containers, and a workshop. A wooded area surrounded the farm, and there was also a small pond. The officers had many areas to search, made more difficult by the enormous amount of junk in the buildings. The barns were filled with old clutter, which the investigators combed through meticulously. Among other things, they found some items that stood out: weapons, including 2 handguns and a shotgun, as well as several rolls of duct tape and cable ties. If Mark Brown was in fact involved in Alexandra Morgan's disappearance, these items could have been used against her. The strangest and most disturbing discovery at Little Bridge was in one shipping container. Inside, it was a small room with an air mattress in one corner and a sort of kitchenette with a microwave and toaster in the other. It looked like someone had been living there, so it was possible the farm's tenant himself had been using it. But what was most unsettling was that the locks on this container were on the outside. That alarmed the officers greatly. They wondered whether someone could have been held prisoner there. Could Mark Brown have unlawfully imprisoned Alexandra Morgan in that shipping container? And where was the woman now? The investigation led the police to search Mark's home as well, where they found total chaos and rooms packed to the brim with belongings. Besides finding more cable ties and duct tape, they also discovered several pairs of handcuffs and hunting knives. Strangest of all was that multiple shopping bags filled with human feces were stored in the attic. Even if Brown had nothing to do with the woman's disappearance, that detail alone suggested he was not a normal person. Alexandra Morgan's house in Kent was searched again, but as before, everything seemed in order. The only thing that stood out to investigators was a little note that Alex had left for one of her sons, inviting him to go roller skating with her. At first, they thought nothing of it because it appeared harmless, but eventually it became clear that the note contained a clue she had left for her son, instructing him to look inside the roller skate box. Investigators learned where the boy kept his skates and found the box under his bed. Next to the skates, they discovered more than £22,000 in cash. There was also another note from Alex saying that the money was for her sons in case something happened to her. She had likely stashed the cash in the roller skate box on the day she supposedly went to the spa. But why was she afraid that something might happen to her? We now know that Alex was actually on her way to Little Bridge Farm. The postcode she wrote on the note confirmed that route. Did this mean she was afraid of Mark Brown? Had she suspected that once she visited the farm, she might never come back? Next to the money and the note, the box also contained a cell phone, along with a PIN code written on a piece of paper. Investigators checked the phone, the one Alex likely used to contact Mark Brown, and it turned out to be the phone she had used to reach escort clients. Her messages talked about a film job scheduled for that morning, for which she had supposedly been promised £100,000. That amount would have completely changed her life. Before she disappeared, Alexandra had even Googled what she could buy with that much money and how to invest it profitably. Apparently, Alex had agreed to the filming, since she was already thinking about what to do with that amount. At the same time, her behavior clearly showed she was nervous and afraid of what Mark Brown had proposed. It was no coincidence that she took precautions and left clues in the roller skate box. Her worst fears came true. Investigators concluded that she was dead after being on Little Bridge Farm, because according to Brown, she never left the farm on November 14. However, on the evening of November 17, the farm's owner was filmed by a surveillance camera near a landfill, showing him in his white work van, followed by Alex's car, the white Mini Cooper. The question was who was driving her car at that point, since the police assumed that by then she had already been killed. Based on phone records, investigators determined that Mark's companion, who was driving that night, was a man named Darren Ripley. Data from cell towers showed that both men's phones were in the same place at the same time, and that they were moving in the same direction at the same speed, as if following each other in cars. When the police asked Ripley to come in for questioning, he was clearly frightened and quite open with them. He said he sometimes helped Mark Brown repair old cars for resale. On the evening of November 17, Mark had asked Darren for a favor, telling him to remove a white Mini Cooper from his property. Ripley did not know who the car belonged to and assumed it was left there for repairs. He agreed, took the wheel and followed Mark, which is how Alexandra Morgan's Mini Cooper ended up on Homehurst Lane in Hastings, barely 6.5 kilometers from the farm. Brown told Darren to park the car on the roadside, and both men then drove away in Mark's van. As soon as the investigators got this information, they headed to Homehurst Lane and found the missing woman's white Mini Cooper there. Alex herself was nowhere to be seen. The officers feared they might find her body in the trunk, but it was empty. The car was taken to a police lot, where experts found no signs of its owner and no direct proof of a killing. All they had was video footage of Mark Brown disposing of Alexandra Morgan's Mini Cooper, but it did not prove he had murdered her. The police still did not know how he might have killed Alex or where he had hidden her body, so they kept searching. They combed the farmland, the barns, and every structure, even draining a small pond on the farm. Meanwhile, other investigators checked all of Mark Brown's workplaces because he worked in multiple locations. Over time, they learned that, in addition to repairing and selling old cars, he was also working at a construction site. This detail drew the investigators' attention. Around the time Alex disappeared, Mark was working at a building site near Sevenoaks in Kent, where a house was under construction and there was a lot of waste lying around. The police wondered if he might have tried to discard evidence there. Indeed, the property owners told them that Brown had asked if he could throw an old dishwasher into their trash container. They had agreed, but there was no dishwasher in that container. Instead, the police found a burned oil drum. Experts took the drum out and discovered it contained the charred remains of items someone had clearly tried to destroy, including a woman's bag with personal items like deodorant and makeup setting spray, a small hairdryer, and some hairpins, plus fragments of women's jewelry scattered around. All these items were sent to the crime lab, where DNA analysis showed they had belonged to the missing Alexandra Morgan. Worst of all, among the half-burned things in the drum were tiny bits resembling human bone fragments. Unfortunately, these were so small that experts could not extract DNA to confirm whose remains they were. But because they were found in an oil drum together with Alex's belongings, the police were certain they must be hers. That certainty grew when they also discovered tooth fragments among the pieces of bone. The forensic odontologist confirmed that these teeth belonged to Alex. The police now had a fairly clear picture of what had happened after her death. Mark Brown had evidently burned her body in that oil drum and then tried to hide the remains in someone else's trash container. If the garbage had been collected sooner, he might have been able to cover up his crime. He clearly knew how to dispose of her body in a way that left almost nothing behind except a few teeth and bone fragments, but he miscalculated by disposing of the drum at his workplace. On November 28, about 2 weeks after Alexandra Morgan disappeared, Mark Brown was charged with killing the 34-year-old woman, but that was not all. The investigation into him was not yet over because the police soon made another discovery. Alex might not have been his only victim. While searching Mark Brown's white work van, investigators found a prescription made out to a woman named Lea Ware. When they looked into Lee's background, they discovered she had been reported missing. Her close relatives had come forward, saying they had not seen or heard from her for months. In November 2021, it had already been half a year since anyone last saw her. She had simply vanished in May 2021. Lea was 32 years old and the mother of 3 children. Overall, she was a very friendly, caring young woman, described by those close to her as cheerful and outgoing, always trying to see the good in people. Unfortunately, many took advantage of her kindness, and she had been dealing with serious mental health problems. She had been diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder, was undergoing treatment, and was taking medication. Because of her health issues, Lea had lost custody of her children. That fact weighed heavily on her, but her relatives believed she would never have disappeared willingly. She had left home occasionally in the past when her illness worsened, but she always returned. Her family never officially reported her missing to the police, hoping she would return on her own. However, once the authorities found her prescription in Mark Brown's van, they feared something worse had happened to her. Could Brown have done to her what he had done to Alexandra Morgan? The Sussex police, who were working with the Kent force by then, reached out to Mark Brown, who was in custody for Alexandra's killing, and asked him what he knew about Lea and where she was. Brown said he had no idea where Lea might be, but he admitted he knew her and had even been in a relationship with her. He claimed to have met her when she was struggling with mental issues, saying he helped her through those difficulties, and then they parted ways. The investigators did not believe his story and dug deeper. The investigation showed that Brown had met Lea the same way he had met Alex, through the escort site. Lea was also an escort who had been listed on the website Jobs for Adults. It emerged that Mark Brown had been in touch with a series of women on that site who worked in the adult industry. Investigators spoke to women who had been in contact with him and asked them about their impressions of him as a client. One woman recounted how one day during intercourse, Mark Brown wrapped his arms around her neck and squeezed so hard she thought she was going to die. She tapped his arm, but he would not stop or loosen his grip. At that moment, she believed her life was over. Fortunately, she eventually came to her senses. When they checked Brown's computer and phone, the police discovered very disturbing details. His browser history showed he was aroused by violent adult films, revealing what a sick and twisted mind he had. The scenes that excited him involved total power and control over women, like the ones he found on that site. As mentioned, Lea and Mark met there, first messaging each other in March 2018, more than 3 years before her disappearance, and they kept meeting regularly. Over time, this grew into more than just an intimate arrangement, despite the fact that Mark already had a wife and child, because Brown continued living a double life. He even bought a van for Lea and brought it to Little Bridge Farm, letting her live there with her animals. Lea was a big fan of 4-legged pets and had 3 goats, a horse, and 2 dogs, a senior Great Dane and a Pomeranian Spitz. Lea lived in that van on Little Bridge Farm until the farm's owners, from whom Brown leased the workshop, became aware that someone was living there without permission. They demanded that the van be removed. Instead of finding somewhere else for it or selling it, Brown simply set it on fire. Lea had nowhere to live, so Brown decided to put her in a shipping container on the same farm, bringing her medication, water, and food, forbidding her to leave without his permission and disallowing any visitors. He essentially isolated her from everyone, turning her into a captive in a cell. Whenever he was in a bad mood or had a problem, Brown took it out on Lea. The police had already inspected that small living area on the farm with the air mattress and the improvised kitchen, and had been puzzled to find the locks on the outside of the container rather than inside. Now, they understood that Brown had deliberately attached the locks to the outside of Lea's quarters. This told them even more about his relationship with her. He treated Lea like an animal to be caged. Convinced that Mark Brown had also done something to Lea, the investigators searched Little Bridge Farm again for clues about the second missing woman. This time, search teams combing the nearby woods found what appeared to be bones, but on examination, they were revealed to be animal remains. Forensic experts determined they belonged to a dog. The police suspected it might have been Lea's Pomeranian. Nearby, they discovered a small pink dog collar with a massive chain attached to it, weighing about 12 kilograms. Apparently, Brown had disposed of the little dog by attaching a weight that made it impossible for it to move, leaving it in the woods to die. Investigators still had no idea where Lea might be. They did not know whether Brown had done to her what he did to the dog, leaving her somewhere in the woods to be torn apart by wild animals. They decided to ask Mark directly, but as before, when it came to Alexandra Morgan, he answered all their questions with no comment and refused to speak further. With no direct information from Brown, they kept searching for clues and drawing their own conclusions. The police checked Lea's phone records to find an approximate time of death, since they had no doubt she was no longer alive. Lea disappeared in May 2021, and it turned out that her phone was last online on May 8. On the evening of May 7, both Lea's and Mark's phones were traced to the same place, Little Bridge Farm, at the same time. Suddenly, both phones went offline, which the police took to mean they had gone inside the shipping container and closed the door, causing them to lose signal. That night was presumably the night Lea's life ended tragically. They believe Mark opened the container door at some point, letting his phone reconnect. But Lea's phone never appeared online again because it remained inside after she died. This suggests that she never left that makeshift cage. As soon as the door closed, her phone was disconnected and was never seen again. Lea was not heard from after that. The police list May 7, 2021 as her official date of death. After Lea's disappearance, Mark continued living his normal life. It turned out that he used Lea's debit card to withdraw all the money from her bank account and continued getting her prescription medications for anxiety and depression, so it would look like she was still alive. Precisely what he did to Lea and how he disposed of her remains was still unknown, at least until investigators spoke with someone else in Mark's life. After Lea vanished, Brown started chatting on social media with a former classmate named Beth. They had attended high school together and been good friends, but lost touch after graduation. Investigators discovered from Mark's phone records that he reconnected with Beth in June 2021, and they began chatting online. The two old friends reminisced about their school days, updated each other on their successes, and talked about life, trying to revive their friendship. In their messages, Beth mentioned that she was going through a difficult time, having recently divorced her husband and now struggling alone with her children. Mark offered his support, promised always to be there for her, and even invited her to spend a weekend with her children on the leased farm. Over time, their relationship shifted from friendship to something more. The police asked Beth if she knew anything about Mark's previous girlfriend, and strangely, Beth immediately said Lea was dead, even though Lea was still officially only missing, and word of her presumed death had not been made public. Beth explained that she had learned about Lea's death from Mark and showed them one of his messages. One of these messages was very important to the investigators. It was sent in June 2021, 1 month after Lea disappeared, and stated that Lea's remains had been dealt with in the same way as Alexandra Morgan's, burned in an oil drum. Beth had never really understood the message. It mentioned that an old oil drum and 5 liters of diesel had spared Mark all his problems. Brown was confessing his crime, saying that he had done awful things that now weighed heavily on his heart, mind, and soul. He called himself a psychopath with a conscience and told his girlfriend how much it scared him. Beth had not spoken to Mark for a while and had no idea he was essentially telling her how he had destroyed evidence and disposed of a body. She misunderstood his words, thinking he was upset about a breakup and was burning his ex's belongings. In February 2022, 3 months after Mark Brown's arrest for Alexandra Morgan's death, he was also charged with the murder of Lea Ware, even though Lea's body had never been recovered. The police were convinced by the evidence. Everything indicated the woman was no longer alive. Allegedly, Mark Brown also intended Beth to be his third victim. He had begun with the same approach as with Lea and Alex, first offering friendship and financial help. If the police had not caught him, he might have become a serial killer, and Beth had no idea how close she had come to a tragedy. The trial against Mark Brown concluded at the end of 2022. His lawyer tried to portray Alexandra's death as an accident, saying she supposedly slipped on some tools in the workshop and hit her head, and that Brown panicked and did not know what else to do, so he disposed of her body. As for Lea, the lawyer maintained that she was still alive and had gone traveling with friends. Luckily, the jury did not believe him because he could not support his claims. Brown was ultimately found guilty in both cases, and it was proven that the tragic deaths of Alexandra Morgan and Lea Ware were his responsibility. He received 2 9-year sentences, to be served concurrently. The judgment reflected the barbarity of his actions and ensured that he would never again endanger another woman's life. Before passing sentence, the judge urged Mark Brown to reveal what he had done with Lea's body, so her family could bury her remains. He promised to take this into account in sentencing. Mark refused to say where Ware's remains were, and so her body has never been found. He did not appear in court for the verdict, refusing to hear the victims' families hold him to account for the killings, preferring to remain in his cell. He was too much of a coward to face the people whose lives he had destroyed. This man exploited the women's vulnerability, their mental health issues, their financial troubles, and their loneliness. He skillfully manipulated their deepest insecurities to gain their trust and used it for his own gain. Yet he did not reckon with one thing. The young single mother Alexandra Morgan anticipated such an outcome and left clues that helped solve his crimes. She not only helped clarify the circumstances of her own death, but may also have aided the investigation into the death of Lea Ware. Thank you for watching and take care.